today, what we're going to talk about is creating our own path. In the class, we have been addressing finding our way and particularly looking at what it means to hear or find our call, meaning there's a already underlying beliefs when I make that statement, underlying beliefs that there is a God who has a particular role and function for you in your life, whether that means to raise a family and be a parent, to be a psychotherapist or a counselor or a linebacker for the Chicago Bears, or if that means that you are going to um, develop certain qualities and characteristics. Calling is very broad, it's very diverse. Today we're going to look at more of an idea of you creating your meaning rather than maybe the meaning coming from the outside or some outside force, you creating it. So this is part 2 of a conversation. And we know that last time on Monday, the video recording we had, we talked about how we make decisions. And we looked at a particular Christian model of making decisions called the Ignatius Model. And I'll just quickly go through when you're trying to decide between two things, like, whether do I go to the University of Pikeville or do I go to, Georgetown College, or, do I go to, Big Sandy Community Technical College? Let's say that's the decision you're trying to make. All of those are good and positive choices. None of them are bad. So you can continue to go on with this model. The next thing you would do is have to identify the particular thing that you're trying to decide. And you want to be as clear as possible. So let's say the decision is going to the University of Pikeville and studying in the nursing program. Okay, that's the decision you're trying to make, whether I go to the University of Pikeville and study nursing or not. And what you would do then is you would very clearly state the proposal of your decision, which we just did, right? Like going to the University of Pikeville to study nursing. Then you would pray and ask God to give you an open heart that would say, whatever is decided in this process, I want you, God, to receive the glory. And I want to go into this decision-making process with a heart that is clear, but also that says that, it doesn't matter. To go or to not go, I will honor whatever you lead me in, God. That's called holy indifference. The next thing you would do after praying and preparing your heart is you would talk to wise counselors, people of insight. So the kind of like your spiritual mentor, important people, could be a parent, a coach, a teacher, a wise person in your town, and you would get their counsel and insight. You would lay out for them the decision that you have to make, and you would hear what they have to say. Then you would list all the reasons for and against this proposal. This proposal would, you would, what are the advantages for me to go to the university? What are the disadvantages? That kind of model. Okay, so as you weigh both pros and cons, for and against. And then what you would do is you would reflect on how you feel in this process. As you're particularly, let's say when you are talking to your support person, mentor, advisor, coach, where is your heart when it comes to those things? Just recently, I was talking with somebody, and they were talking about a decision that they had to make. And when they simply were sharing with me the options of their life, you could tell where they were most passionate. As they were telling me, they started almost trying to sell me on one particular choice. And simply then I just reflected back to them and said, It seems like your decision's already kind of made. You are really passionate about this. And they were like, oh yeah, you're actually, yeah, you're right, Um, so you would ask yourself which choice brings the most energy, the most life to you. And then finally, in this process, this model of trying to make decisions, you would simply ask God then to give you a peace and dedicate that decision to God. So this is kind of a model, a very quick model. We dealt with it on Monday in the video on Monday, but I just quickly wanted to throw it out there to you. Now, today, let's go back here. What we're doing today is looking at two persons from the Bible and their call. And the first person is Mary of Nazareth, and maybe you're not familiar with um, that title for her, Mary of Nazareth. But of course, in the ancient world, just like when we think of Jesus, of course, Jesus's last name is not the Christ. That's a title. He would have been known as Jesus of Nazareth. That's just his home area. So Mary is Jesus's mother, and Mary has become in the Christian church the model beyond all models of what faith looks like. So, for example, if you would walk in today to a Roman Catholic church or a Greek Orthodox church, you're going to see statues, images, pictures, stained glass windows of Mary. Typically, something kind of like what you see here on the screen, Mary holding the baby. A lot of times in these churches, you'll see the adult Mary holding kind of the small baby Jesus. And some people will say, well, wait a minute. Why is it that Mary seems to be almost getting more um, value or importance than Jesus? And here's the reason why. Christians believe that Mary literally put her body on the line to honor God. God called her in Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 39, and then later verses 46 to 54. God called her to be a parent to Jesus. And in this call, her life is marked by faithfulness. So Mary was engaged to be married, but she was not yet officially married. And we know in the ancient world, to have a child before you're married would have been really problematic, very problematic. And this is exactly what happens to Mary. She becomes pregnant, um, but the miraculous claim of the Christian faith is that she has what's called a virgin birth, right? She has a child without the sexual experience. Now, a lot of people are going to argue about that and say, how is that biologically possible? That seems like kind of like a made up story. I'm not asking you to believe into anything, just hear out the claim. And the Christian claim is that God sends an angel to talk with Mary, and that the angel says that you have been, highly favored of God. God has chosen you, and you will have this child, this one that the people have been waiting for, the Christ child, the Messiah. And Mary was probably somewhere between 13 and 15 years old when this happens to her. And the radical thing is this: Mary says yes. She says, be it to me according to your will. I am the handmaiden or the servant of God. And this revolutionary, radical act of trust is stunning. I mean, it's just stunning, because everything that Mary had to possibly lose, right? We know that in the story, her engaged husband, Joseph, decides that he's going to quietly divorce her, but he wouldn't have had to, right? He could have clearly really exposed her, shamed her, all these different things. And Mary has the child, of course, raises Jesus up, and very faithfully mothers him. Mary's call was really misunderstood. People around her didn't understand it. But she was called to be a parent. She was called to be faithful. She was called to support another person. Her life was really about supporting and honoring what God was going to do through Jesus. And in that, she was being made holy. She was being made whole. And she then later in Jesus's life, especially when Jesus dies on the cross, um, she becomes the mother of these followers of Jesus. She becomes the motherly figure, although her call was really grounded in a lot of suffering. You can imagine being called to love somebody who you know is going to die a really difficult death. Um, Although parents do that now, right? Parents who have a child that's born with a terminal disease or a really complicating health matter love their children, faithfully care for their children, and to the point even though you know your child is going to die. So Mary, I think, is a really, really helpful image for what call looks like in people's lives, because it's not like Mary had some kind of amazing job. She wasn't like a doctor or a lawyer or a judge or politician or psychotherapist. She was called to be a parent. She was called to be faithful. She was called to trust, and to trust in the most difficult of circumstances. So if your call in life isn't so clear that it's like you should be this exact job with this exact location in this exact town, and here's what you're going to do, take heart. Neither was Mary's. Mary's call was simply to, not simply, but her call was to be a mother, to honor her child, and in that the skills, the characteristics, the qualities that was being developed in Mary would be used to help other people over time, right? She was going to mother other people. Now granted, she would have most likely probably worked outside the home also to have to survive, but none of that defined her. Really, the call to mothering was her ultimate call. Okay. The second person I want to look at quickly is a person from the Hebrew Bible by the name of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah, he has a book of the Bible written after him called Jeremiah. Also, there's a second book that he wrote, a very small book called Lamentations. Now, the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament is 52 chapters long. It's like one of the two longest books of the Hebrew Bible, yet Lamentations is only 5 chapters. Now, interestingly enough, in Jeremiah chapter 1, and I'm going to pull this up here, Jeremiah chapter 1, and as we look at it, we're looking at the first verses of his life. And here's what it says. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I don't know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, do not say that I am too young. You must go to everyone that I send to you and say whatever I command you. Don't be afraid of them, for I am with you, and I will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand, touched my mouth, and said, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Now, Jeremiah's call is very different. The creative writing of the Bible, the creative writing of the story claims that Jeremiah was literally called to be God's messenger and God's prophet, even while he was in the womb. Now, a lot of people will look at that and say that, God has a plan for us even while we were in the womb, even before we were born, God has a plan for us. But Jeremiah's struggle is this, right? he felt this call at a very, very young age. Now, what would you do with somebody today who has a small child, 5 or 6 years old, that says, hey, I'm called to do this kind of big or extraordinary thing? Most of us, if we would hear that, we would, kind of snicker a little bit and tap the kid on the head and say, oh, that's great. I'm so glad that, you think you're going to be the president or an astronaut or, the one who cures cancer. That's great. Go study hard. We probably wouldn't take it too serious. Now, imagine if that child came to you and said something really serious, like, um, I am going to be the spokesperson of the United States' downfall, and I will predict and share how the United States is going to be horribly destroyed and taken over by, the Chinese nation or the Russian nation, or, right? We would probably look at the child kind of like some kind of freak, almost looking very suspicious, like maybe your child should get therapy, right? Clearly, Jeremiah in his life would have felt intensely misunderstood. They call Jeremiah the weeping prophet because his message was so difficult to handle. And he was prophesying or sharing how the nation of Israel would be ultimately destroyed and they would suffer intensely. His protest about being a child really isn't coming from the womb, of course, but it means his whole life he'd been trying to resist this call because it wasn't this joyous, happy, wealth, success, and apple pie kind of call. It was a call that was going to be really difficult. We do know that ultimately Jeremiah does embrace it. His message is really not appreciated. He's thrown into a well. He's nearly killed. He's arrested. But what he does share does happen. The Israelites are destroyed by the Babylonians, and everything about the city of Jerusalem is destroyed. Jeremiah finds his life in immense suffering. So as we look at two figures, we look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, and her call to be faithful to mother, support other people, and in that process, she herself develops the characteristics and the qualities that God was inviting for her to have. We now look at the prophet Jeremiah and his call. His call was with him from the very beginning of his life. Very clearly, he's had a sense from whenever he was conscious, kind of his idea, but it was a difficult labor. But his sense of call, I think this is the thing that's really important to understand about Jeremiah, is that unless we have a really clear sense of call or vocational pathway, we won't be able to endure the difficult moments, right? We see high levels of burnout in particular jobs. And a lot of times we see high levels of burnout in particular professions. And what I mean by burnout is that people like quit, even though they might go to school for all those years to be this thing, 5 or 6 years into it, and they ultimately quit. Why do we see burnout? Well, burnout's not because people are working too much. Burnout doesn't happen because people are underpaid. Burnout doesn't happen because it's taking too much time away from family. Burnout happens because we are separated from our original why we went into it. People who can stay tied to and reminded of and aware of and experiencing their why, their reason, their sense of call, stay in careers, stay in pathways, stay in marriages a lot longer. But when we forget our original why, things collapse. So that's, I think, important to remember with the prophet Jeremiah. Now, what I want us to look at real quick is, when people talk about their calling, oftentimes people will use religious language, like God is calling me to this. Now, whether that's language that you use in your life or you simply will be dealing with people, supporting people, listening to people who use that language, it's really important to help people, help yourself discern how to use that language. Well, we know there are really 3 different ways of knowing something, right? Number one, there's the kind of the rational way of knowing something. like how much rain has happened, or what is rain. We can use scientific, measurable, provable qualities, characteristics, tools, such as the scientists right now who are beautifully, passionately working on a vaccine for COVID, which is incredible, right? Scientific, measurable, provable. We're going to look this month at the 2 or 3 companies that have a possible vaccine out there. They'll go through boards, they'll be vetted by independent people, all kinds of trials. I mean, there's been thousands of people who've already taken this vaccine to see what kind of long-term side effects it has, all this. That's a rational, scientific way of knowing. A second way of knowing is relational. It's less, less measurable. Relational knowing, such as I know you as friend, you know me as friend, you know your parent, you know your lover. This is usually warm, personable, very subjective. You can't measure that, right? But I know you as friend. The third way of knowing is where it gets very slippery, and that's what we call revelation. It's this supernatural, spontaneous, or can be supernatural, but it's a spontaneous, given insight. Let's say for a long time you've been wrestling with some problem or situation, and all of a sudden, in like an epiphany, you have an insight about it that helps you navigate and problem solve. And it's like, oh my gosh, yes, like this is the path, right? We would call that revelation. You've been given an insight. Now, whether you want to say that's from God or not, but that you've been given this type of insight. So 3 ways of knowing: rational, relational, and revelation. I want to talk about, obviously, God's call on a person's life isn't rational, right? You can't, I can't look at your life and measure it and kind of use the scientific method to show whether that's God's call or not. We're into the land of subjectivity when we start talking about that. So God's call is relational. So the person must listen and wait, develop relational skills with oneself and with their divine, with God. But God's call is also then a revelation, meaning it's a gift. God shares it with a person. Usually it comes over time and in a variety of ways. The difficulty is there isn't a straight how to, like, this is how God's call is going to look in everyone's life. That if that were the case, we could come back to the scientific method, but we can't. So this is where some crazy stuff can happen. People can say, hey, God's called me to, kill my neighbors. And like, I don't think so. So it's relational, but it's also based in revelation. So here are the hallmarks of God's call in a person's life. And this comes from Dr. Ben Campbell Johnson's work, Hearing God's Call. There's clarity, persistence, progression, congruence of our call and our circumstances, convergence of events, conviction, peace, and ecstasy. Let me talk about what those are real quick. Clarity usually comes in a form that is clear, right? It doesn't have to be a warm and fuzzy, I just, the skies opened up and I just had this great sense of peace and butterflies. No, but you know that you know. Number 2, there is a persistence about this call that stays with you in your life. Something that's gnawing at you in the back of your mind that you can't seem to shake, right? When people start talking about this type of thing, you perk up, you're interested. You find yourself watching on YouTube or Netflix. You find yourself when you're somewhere and you overhear someone talking about it, or you're at the library and you see a book about it, you just stop. We find out this persistence comes from Jesus said about his own kind of awareness with people. Jesus said, listen, I'm at the door knocking. It's really important to take the pressure off yourself and the idea that somehow you're going to miss your call for life. Missing your call isn't a one-time thing. It's a consistent, in your gut, in the back of your head kind of awareness that you kind of know already a little bit about yourself. What we're going to find out, though, is that God's call not only is clear and persistent, but it also happens as progression. What I mean is, it happens in the midst of your life. You don't have to go out into the woods for 6 months to figure it out. Now, that would be cool if your life circumstances would allow that for you to take intentional time. We know we talked earlier in class about the Native American tradition of vision quest, which would be fantastic if all people would have that cultural space and time to do that. But really, we see God's call happen while we're in the midst of something else. We know in a story in the New Testament, Peter was out fishing when Jesus encountered him. So the call really unfolds as our life is happening, right? So maybe, like, we surprisingly get pregnant, or our girlfriend or wife suddenly gets pregnant. It was clearly not in our plan, and we're like, oh my gosh, my life is ruined. But over that time of raising the child, things develop in your life, and you go, oh, this is actually what I was called to do. So we see a progression. We also see what we call congruence of our call and our circumstances. Rather than us having to force and make things happen, we see how over time doors begin to open for us, right? So maybe knowing what we're supposed to do with our life in the first part of college doesn't work for us, no matter how hard we try to figure it out. But later, someone gives us a job or a summer opportunity, and in those experiences, the doors open for us to realize and become aware of our sense of call. In God's call, with the clarity and the persistence and the progression and the congruence of call and circumstances, we also see where events start lining up. And I mean events that happen that are unmistakable. We can't excuse them to luck or chance. I'll give you an example in my own life. When my first wife and I moved to India, there were a series of events that happened that we couldn't make it up. We couldn't chance it. I mean, what started in my graduate school studies, they had opened up a program where 6 students were going to go to India, and in that they approached me about going. And when they approached me about going, somebody paid for my trip. Right before I was ready to leave on this trip, about 2 weeks prior to my leaving on the trip, the church where I was serving, we had the possibility of some scheduling changed, and some missionaries who were in from India were looking for a spot to come speak to a church. They reached out to me and said, would you be willing to allow us to come to your church and speak? And of course, when they came to speak at the church, we took them to dinner, and what we found out was they lived in this particular part of India. And at the end of the night, they said, hey, we are almost 70 years old. We're looking for a couple to come serve with us and then allow us to retire and replace us. And I said, well, gosh, that's so weird. I said, I'm about to go to India. And they started asking where I'd be going, and I told them, and they said, well, you should ask your professor if you can kind of leave the scheduled programming and come see our place. Well, my professor was never one to allow us to deviate from anything. But right before we left for the trip in India, I asked my prof, I said, on this one particular day, can I leave the group and, be picked up and go visit this place? And the prof said yes. And when I did that in India and went to visit the place, I felt an instant kind of connection with the people that I'd be working with. Came back home, shared that with people, shared that with my church. And my church said, we feel like you are absolutely being called. So these are situations and circumstances that we just couldn't make up. It just happened to all line up. Now, A couple other hallmarks of God's call is this sense of conviction, right? That you know in your life that you must do this. Your life circumstances lead you in this path. That to do something else would feel like a violation of who you are. And then when you start declaring that, moving towards it, seeking out the training or degrees, you have an inner sense of peace, almost a sense of joy that comes with it, even though it's tough. And people are like, why are you doing this to yourself? You should quit. But you feel this sense of joy and peace. It's like, no, like, I know that I know I'm supposed to do this. So here are some paths, that's not the right term. Here are some characteristics of God's call. So when you hear someone say they're called by God, particularly if you're working with them in kind of a mentor, coach, counselor role, I would encourage you to use these steps to start thinking about it. And of course, this PowerPoint is on Module 7. Now, I wanted to share with you this quote. I think it's great. This is such a famous prayer. And this was penned by a guy by the name of Thomas Merton. He actually lived right outside of Louisville. He was a monk in the 1960s, and Thomas Merton was a part of a religious community that lived in complete silence. But Thomas Merton started writing, and in his writing, he became really, really famous. And here's what Thomas Merton said. He says, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me, but I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. I know that you will lead me by the right road, though I may not know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always. You are ever with me, and you will not lead me to face my perils alone. I love the honesty of this prayer. I have no idea where I'm going. I don't see the road ahead of me. But the fact that I'm trying to please you, God, does in fact please you. This is a great quote. Now, in the last section of our time, I want to talk really quickly about what's the difference between living a happy life and a meaningful life. Because for so many of us, we are searching out happiness. And happiness is usually rooted and grounded in getting what we want. A meaningful life, however, is a little different. Meaningful life means that we are doing things that express who we are, and oftentimes that doing is done for other people. So as opposed to getting what we want, we really are empowering and serving other people. Happiness focuses on our pleasure. Meaning focuses on giving as opposed to taking. Happiness focuses on feeling good in the present. A meaningful life seeks to put together the pieces of our past, our present, and our future, even those painful things, the abuse, the neglect, the sudden death, the tragic loss, all of these painful things we seek to put into our life to create a puzzle of meaning and purpose. Happiness without a sense of meaning ultimately is going to lead to despair and sadness at the end of your life. We know that scientists, researchers, psychologists tell us, those who work with the dying tell us that even though a person may have had a life full of pleasure, if they don't have meaning, it will ultimately lead to a sense of emptiness and despair, sadness really. But meaning, however, even though a person can have a meaningful life, it doesn't always mean it's going to be filled with happiness. But at the end of life, when people are dying, if they've lived a life of meaning, they do not feel this sense of regret or sorrow. Actually, they appears like they feel a sense of settledness and purpose, that they have lived out what they were to do for the world. So I pause for a second to have you reflect. look at the categories of the happy life, look at the categories of the meaningful life. Is there anything in your life that you need to shift to begin to live for meaning as opposed to happiness? Because really at the end, you want to live a life that will bring contentment to you. Now, in the next 14 minutes or so, I want us to talk about Viktor Frankl. At the beginning of our class, way back when I thought class would end up looking differently, and we would have these journal exercises and we were going to read a couple more books, what I realized is that was way too much for us to do. And we already in class have given you a lot to process and to think about and to do. And for some of you, it may feel like busy work, but really what we're doing is just doing a lot of self-reflection. And self-reflection is rooted and grounded in you giving the time and energy. Sure, you can do these things quickly and they can be annoying, or you can really sit with them and think about them and to really ask the hard questions. Well, at the end of the course, we were to read this book called Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's work. We didn't get to it. The next time I teach the course, I will make some changes and we absolutely will use the book. But I wanted to highlight here in the next few minutes the life of Viktor Frankl and a little bit about his teachings. We can't go out of this class without having to address his search for meaning, right? So Viktor Frankl said this: our greatest freedom we have is the freedom to choose our attitude. Now, the picture below you is Viktor Frankl standing outside the concentration camp many, many years later. Viktor Frankl spent 3 years at Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the most famous of the concentration camps. And Viktor Frankl's life, what I think it's really important to realize is that his discoveries about life were only confirmed in the concentration camp. He didn't discover them in the concentration camp because Viktor Frankl was actually a brilliant scholar prior to him going into the concentration camp. But I want to come back to his quote again because I think that many of us don't fully get what he's saying. Our greatest freedom, the greatest thing that we have inside of us, is our abilities to choose our attitude. Now, it says nothing about our circumstances because our circumstances a lot can be way outside of our own control, right? I mean, someone can come in right now in my office and shoot me in the face. I have no control over that. At the end of the day, human resources could walk in my office and fire me. I could get home tonight and my kids could have gone to the doctor and received a bad diagnosis. My wife could leave me. I could get in a car accident on my way home. All of these things could happen to me and radically, completely, 100% alter my life forever. And I have no control over it. But what I do have control over is how I'm going to respond to it. My attitude, I choose. It says nothing of my circumstances, but what I can choose is my attitude. Now, Viktor Frankl, psychologist, psychotherapist, he came up with something called Logotherapy. This is really therapy that makes meaning. Use this word, really important. Makes meaning. Rather than like finding our call, we make our call. We make meaning. So he's a world famous psychologist and thinker. And he, if you know anything about psychology, Viktor Frankl worked alongside Sigmund Freud, who is really the father of modern psychology, him and William James. And early in Frankl's life, 20 years old, he was already being published and writing about psychotherapy. And so, which is just crazy to think about. So the center of Frankl's work is this: all people, every one of us, are in the process and yearn to make meaning in our lives. This is the very reason why we exist, is to articulate, express, and live out purpose and meaning. So Frankl wrote the book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's considered one of the 20th century's most important books. And what he discusses in there is the search for meaning and how he kept this, that Viktor Frankl, how he kept this search going in the concentration camp, and how this quest for or searching for meaning and making meaning kept him alive. Now, when he first published this book, Man's Search for Meaning, obviously you can tell it's a dated book, because really it should be, humanity's search for meaning. But when he first published this book, he didn't include his name on it, because he didn't want it to be sensationalized and sold just because, like, oh, here's this person's life experience in the concentration camp. But it took off and sold so well. And Frankl gave credit to the fact that it was because people in their inner being were suffering from an anxiety about maybe a sense of not having purpose and meaning. And they were looking for something to help them find out. So, of course, Frankl's key idea is that every one of us are searching to live out, to express, to know, to find, to make our meaning. The opposite of that is what Frankl called existential vacuum. When we do not have that, we do not have that awareness of our quest. We do not think that meaning is possible. We do not think that meaning is even that it even exists. That's going to lead to what's called existential dread. Frankl ultimately believed that it would lead to radical despair and maybe even suicidal ideas. So now, here's some more on Frankl. Interestingly enough, in his life, he was already working on a major book. He was working on a book called The Doctor and the Soul prior to his arrest. And when he was arrested and ultimately sent to the concentration camp for 3 years, he was arrested and his family was arrested. He was also recently married. His pregnant wife was arrested. Frankl's parents, his brother, his pregnant wife, all died while in Auschwitz. He was the only one who survived. But when he was working on this book, Doctor and the Soul, he was really developing his theory of logotherapy. And he carried with him the beginning of his manuscript, meaning his work, his book. He carried with him in the inside lining of his coat. So he ripped out part of the lining of his coat, stuffed down pieces of this book, sewed back up his coat, and when he went off and was arrested, he had his book with him. But pretty shortly, very quickly actually, in the process of his brutalization and torture and being a concentration camp prisoner, he had his coat taken from him, and he lost his work. Later in the time of the concentration camp, Frankl started getting small pieces of paper, scraps of paper, and he was writing again his book. Imagine writing your book from memory, right? So here, this just shows you the person that Viktor Frankl is, or was. And one of his key ideas is this: life holds meaning regardless of your circumstances or your situation. Life has meaning regardless of your circumstances. So obviously with Frankl, when he looks at being a Holocaust prisoner, concentration camp prisoner, this could radically change his search and, lead him to despair and all this kind of suffering because his life was horrendous. Yet he sought meaning even in the difficulty, hence his writing of the book, hence his working towards his future, hence him working out his ideas of logotherapy, because he knew what his life was about. And no matter the circumstance, he was going to make that happen. Now, Within logotherapy, here are a couple ideas. It's the idea that you have freedom of will. What I mean by it is that you can choose how you respond to any situation or circumstance. And you also have freedom to make meaning in your life. That is the goal of your life, is to make meaning and to know the meaning. We are free to choose to respond no matter our circumstances. Your circumstances do not control your will or thoughts or feelings. Uh, Frankl argues that the will to meaning is the idea that you are free to achieve your goals and purposes in life. Where our frustration comes, where our destructive behaviors arise. So think addictions, criminal activity, all this kind of stuff happens when we cannot make meaning or we cannot create our meaning in our life. And I'll be very honest with you, I saw this in my dad's life. My dad was a blue collar worker, did heating and cooling his whole life. And then at 60 years old, his body just quit on him. His lungs were not working right anymore. He had such damage to his rotator cuffs that he really couldn't lift his arms up anymore. He couldn't work. He was fully disabled. And that led him to such a spiral of despair that over about a 2-year period, he could never really figure out what his life was about beyond working. And it ultimately led him to psychological breaking. And he ultimately took his life. He died by suicide because he couldn't find the space to find meaning. So Frankl, of course, says that our purpose is trying to find that or make that, and that we can do really, really hard things because of purpose. So think about the football players here at the University of Pikeville. Amazing, right? I mean, you pay all this money, you go through all of these classes, you put your body out on the line. I mean, in a normal year when we don't have COVID, football players come early to campus, usually early July. It's really hot. They go to 2 or 3 a day practices where they're really, sweating and puking and, taped up, iced up, banged up. When you look at that on the outside, you think, man, that's kind of crazy. Why would anyone pay to have that happen to them? But when you look at the meaning, right, being able to play in the game that they love, or the possibility of using this game to pay for college, or to use this game to maybe get further in their life, or to make the league, you see the meaning that's coming from it. Therefore, they're willing to suffer for the purpose. Frankl believes that meaning is actually a real thing. It's not made up. You can actually know and live out your purpose. Here's a couple things in the last minute of class. Here's what Frankl says. It doesn't really matter what we expect from life, but it's really about what life expects from us. We are no longer able to change a situation. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life would not be complete. So he's not surprised by suffering. He sees it as a part. Again, if you know anything about Buddhism, we would say that all life is suffering. Finally, Frankl says this: for success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue. It only does so as the unintended side effects of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than themselves, or success is a byproduct of one's surrender to who you are as a person. There's a video about purpose and logotherapy we can't get to today. On Friday, we don't have Zoom lecture. On Friday, what we have is you already have a discussion post that you're supposed to read a chapter and make a post about that. And but we'll be back for a final Zoom session on Monday. All right. Any questions, comments? Okay. If not, have a great day, guys. See ya.